There is a country in Europe whose people have been arguing about their own origin for over a century, and the argument was never really about history. It was about identity. For generations, Romanians were told a clean story about where they came from. A story taught in schools, carved into monuments, repeated in textbooks, translated into a dozen languages. And for just as long, that story has quietly resisted the one kind of evidence that does not care about national pride. The genome. Not because the DNA proves the old story wrong. It's more unsettling than that. It proves the old story was never the whole story, and that the truth sitting inside modern Romanian ancestry is older, messier, and far more layered than either side of a century-old debate ever wanted to admit. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what Romanians were taught to believe about themselves. The traditional narrative is called Daco-Roman continuity, and on the surface, it sounds almost elegant. Before Rome arrived, the region north of the Danube was home to the Dacians, a powerful Iron Age people, fierce enough that Emperor Trajan needed 2 brutal military campaigns, in the early 2nd century, just to bring their kingdom down. After the conquest, the theory goes, Roman soldiers, colonists, and administrators settled the new province of Dacia. Latin took root. The Dacian and Roman populations merged. And from that fusion, according to the standard story, the Romanian people were born, a population that supposedly preserved an unbroken thread of Roman Dacian ancestry and language for nearly 2,000 years, surviving migrations, invasions, and empires that swept through the region again and again. It's a powerful origin story. It explains why Romanian is a Romance language, an island of Latin grammar surrounded by Slavic-speaking neighbors. It gave a young nation, formed in the 19th century, a proud and ancient pedigree to rally behind. But historians outside Romania were never fully convinced it was that simple. And it turns out, neither was the evidence. The first crack in the story wasn't genetic. It was archaeological and historical, and it had been sitting there for a long time, mostly ignored. Roman Dacia, unlike most Roman provinces, was abandoned. Emperor Aurelian formally withdrew Roman administration and legions from the region around 271 CE, barely a century and a half after Trajan's conquest. That is a strikingly short occupation compared to provinces like Gaul or Hispania, which absorbed Roman culture over 4 or 5 centuries. A century and a half is enough time to leave a mark. It is a thin window to fully replace an entire population's language, culture, and ancestry from the ground up. And after the withdrawal, the historical record for the region north of the Danube goes dark for centuries, a period historians sometimes call, only half-jokingly, the Dark Millennium. Waves of migrating peoples moved through the region: Goths, Huns, Gepids, Avars, Slavs, and later Bulgars and Hungarians. Almost no other region in Europe absorbed that much population turnover in that short a span of history. So the question that quietly nagged at historians for decades was this: how does a population survive that kind of disruption, in that short a window of Roman presence, and still emerge with an intact Latin-based identity 1,000 years later? That question sat mostly unresolved until genetics offered a new kind of evidence, one that doesn't rely on chronicles or inscriptions, but on the biological record carried inside living people and inside the bones of the dead. Modern population genetics uses several different tools to reconstruct a group's history. Autosomal DNA, inherited from all ancestral lines combined, reveals the broad genetic blend of a population, essentially a fingerprint built from every ancestor who contributed to it. Y chromosome DNA, passed only from father to son, and mitochondrial DNA, passed only from mother to child, allow researchers to trace specific lineages back through time along strictly paternal or maternal lines. And when ancient DNA, genetic material extracted directly from skeletal remains, enters the picture, researchers can compare living populations directly against the actual people who once occupied a region, rather than only guessing from written sources. When these tools were applied to Romanian populations, alongside neighboring Balkan, Central European, and Eastern European groups, the results did not simply confirm the Daco-Roman story. And they did not simply demolish it either. What they revealed instead was that Romanian ancestry did not descend from a single clean fusion event. It came together in layers, some of them very old, some of them added much later, and not always in the order the traditional narrative assumed. That was not a contradiction. It was a signal. And it forced researchers to weigh several competing explanations at. The first possibility was that meaningful pre-Roman ancestry, genetic material connected to the Iron Age populations of the Carpathian region, which may include descendants connected to Dacian-era communities, survived the Roman period and the turbulent centuries afterward, contributing a real and measurable ancestral layer to modern Romanians, even if it was never a majority share on its own. The second possibility was that the medieval migrations historians already knew about, Slavic populations moving into the region especially from the 6th century onward, left a far deeper genetic imprint than the traditional narrative acknowledged, blending with existing populations rather than simply passing through. And the third possibility, the one modern genetic research increasingly leans toward, is that both processes happened simultaneously, layered across many centuries. An older regional ancestry, never fully erased, absorbing successive waves of newcomers, generation after generation, without any single population ever being fully replaced. If stories like this fascinate you, the ones where identity, politics, and hard science collide, this is a good moment to subscribe, because almost every national origin story in Europe has a genetic layer underneath it that most people never learn about. The most decisive evidence came from broader, more recent studies that placed Romanian populations directly inside comparative genome-wide datasets alongside dozens of other European and Balkan groups, rather than examining Romanian DNA in isolation, the way earlier, smaller studies often had to. These wider comparisons matter enormously, because ancestry only becomes meaningful in relation to other populations. A signal that looks unique in isolation might turn out to be common across an entire region once enough neighboring groups are included. And a population that looks perfectly uniform up close can reveal internal layering once placed against a large enough backdrop. What these broader datasets showed was that Romanians clustered genetically close to other southeastern European and Balkan populations, a pattern consistent with centuries of regional intermixing rather than total isolation. But within that broader Balkan-adjacent cluster, Romanian populations also carry ancestral components connecting back toward older, pre-migration southeastern European genetic strata, components shared, at lower levels, with some neighboring populations, but present in Romanians at proportions that suggest a persistent, if partial, regional continuity stretching back well before the medieval migrations. That was the twist researchers had not expected walking in. Not a story of an ancient, untouched bloodline stretching in an unbroken line from Dacian kings to modern villagers, the way nationalist narratives sometimes claimed. And not a story of near-total replacement by later migrating populations, the way skeptics of continuity sometimes assumed either. What the genome actually preserved was something in between, older than the skeptics expected, and messier than the traditionalists wanted. The population was not one clean stream. It was a river fed by many older tributaries, some of them flowing all the way back toward the Iron Age communities of the Carpathian Basin, others arriving centuries later and merging in without ever fully overriding what came before. That distinction changes what the whole story means. Because what the evidence suggests is not that Romanians are simply descended from the Romans, and not that they are simply descended from later Slavic migrants, and certainly not that either claim settles a question that was, from the beginning, too complex for a single sentence to hold. Ancestry, especially in a region as fought over as the Carpathians and the lower Danube, does not move in straight lines. It moves the way rivers move, splitting, merging, absorbing tributaries, sometimes disappearing underground for centuries before resurfacing somewhere else, carrying sediment from places no one expected. This is, in fact, the pattern researchers keep finding almost everywhere they look closely enough. Populations are not sealed containers. They are processes, living archives, constantly being rewritten, layer by everyone who ever married in, moved through, or stayed behind when an empire collapsed. Picture, for a moment, the Carpathian foothills in early autumn, mist settling low over beech forests, with smoke rising from villages that have occupied the same hollows in the hills for 1,000 years or more. Somewhere beneath those villages, in soil that has absorbed the ash of countless invasions, lie traces of people who mined salt and gold before Rome ever crossed the Danube, who paid tribute to Roman governors for a century and a half, who watched Roman roads fall into disrepair, who buried their dead through centuries no chronicle bothered to record, and who somehow, against long odds, kept speaking a language descended from Latin in a region surrounded on every side by Slavic tongues. The DNA does not tell us their names. It does not tell us their politics, their loyalties, or what they call themselves. But it tells us they were there. Layer after layer, generation after generation, contributing something that never fully disappeared, even when the historical record about them nearly did. The old debate, Daco-Roman purity on one side, near total population replacement on the other, was never going to survive contact with the genome because both sides were asking the wrong kind of question. They wanted a single answer. The evidence gave them a layered one instead. And that, in the end, may be the most honest thing genetics has to say about any national origin story, not just this one. The people we come from were rarely one people. They were many, meeting, merging, and surviving together, long before anyone thought to write it down, and long before anyone needed a flag to explain who they were. If you want more stories where the evidence quietly rewrites the map of who we think we are, let me know in the comments which population's ancestry I should uncover next. The old story said Romanians were the last Romans standing at the edge of Europe. The genome tells a stranger and, in some ways, a more remarkable story of a population that was never fully conquered, never fully replaced, and never fully one thing at all. Just a long, unbroken habit of surviving in the same hills, absorbing everyone who passed through, and quietly becoming something the history books never had a word for. The map, once again, was too small for what actually happened here.